So when we talk about war with Spain and the emergence of Theodore Roosevelt, specifically trouble in Cuba, the first thing you need to know is at this time in history, the countries of Cuba and Puerto Rico...
Is this the one where they talk about like him having that big stick?
Kind of.
Yeah.
Were really belonged to Spain. Well, we'll go back to 1868, because in Cuba, in 1868, a violent revolution broke out in that country. So we'll go back to 1868 and tell you that in the country of Cuba, a violent revolution broke out, which meant that the people of Cuba were tired of Spanish rule and decided to revolt and try to overthrow the government and become free of Spain. And it was a tough conflict because it took Spain, they wouldn't give up on this, it took Spain 10 years to overthrow this revolution. 10 years of fighting between the country of Cuba and Spain. So in 1868, a violent revolution broke out in Cuba, and it took Spain 10 years to crush down the uprising. And what happens after you revolt and they beat you? How do you get treated after that? Not very good. And after they beat down the Cuban people during those 10 years, they made them work for starvation wages. They treated them poorly. And only the wealthy got wealthier, and the common person got poorer and poorer and poorer. And they got tired of it, so they revolted again in 1895. So after the first revolt was crushed in 1878, the people of Cuba were treated very poorly for another 10 years or so, and they become very tired of the way they're treated, and the people revolt again in 1895. And that's more where we're at now, right, in American history, about around that time period. Well, how do you think Spain reacted to the second revolution?
They're loud.
Well, kind of, they were harsh. They responded savagely. And they put Cubans into concentration camps, treated them horribly. Most of Cuba was in ruins. Starvation and disease was plaguing the entire country. It was a bad, bad situation after the second revolution. And the way the people in Cuba were treated was actually worse than the first time they revolted. And man, it was pretty apparent to people around them. So all of a sudden, who becomes concerned about the way the people in Cuba are treated? The United States of America. So as months passed after this revolution, and it was very apparent of how these Cuban people were being treated, Americans tried to join the Cuban cause. And what made it? What were Americans thinking about? Did this ever happen to Americans where they weren't maybe treated so well they revolted? When did that happen? American Revolution, right? And so, Americans are thinking, wait a minute. We didn't like being treated very poor by the British way back in those days, and I'm sure the Cubans don't like to be treated like that either, although Cuban people were treated much worse than Americans were that led to the American Revolution. Well, pretty soon, two major American newspapers began to sympathize with Cuba. Two newspapers, the New York Journal and the New York World, both on your ID sheet, started running articles about the situation in Cuba and how the United States ought to respond and help these people out. So when you get the media involved, it gets kind of crazy. And two particular newspapers became Cuban sympathizers, the New York Journal and the New York World, two of the bigger newspapers in the United States at the time, and they began writing pro-Cuba articles on how the United States ought to get involved and help these people, etc., etc., etc. Well, when people read this stuff, what do they start thinking? Yeah, we should. Many people in the United States read this, and they said, America has the moral responsibility to try to restore order in Cuba and make sure that the Spanish-led Cuban government treats people properly. So people got on the bandwagon in the United States. And the man that is going to be responsible, inherit all this, is a guy by the name of William McKinley, right? Who was elected president in 1896. And he's going to be inaugurated in March of 1897. And he really doesn't want to go to war with Spain over Cuba. He doesn't think it's a very good idea. Okay? Which he's probably right. But he's getting pressure, is he not? Not only from the media, but now people are starting to hear this and they want something done. So when William McKinley was inaugurated as President of the United States on March 4th, 1897, he strongly opposed war. He did not want the United States involved in a war with Spain over Cuba. Well, something happened on February 16th of 1898 that would force the United States into a war with Spain. Anybody know what happened? Huh? Look at the next subtopic. The sinking of the USS Maine, and the United States goes to war with Spain. So really, McKinley held out from March of 1897 until February of 1898. But our next subtopic will put us into war with Spain, and that's the sinking of the USS Maine, and the United States goes to war with Spain. I'll give it to you again. Okay? So, on February 15th of 1898, February 15th, 1898, there was an American battleship called the USS Maine that was stationed in Havana Harbor in Cuba. Why would the United States military have a battleship in Havana Harbor in Cuba? What? You're close. There are Americans in Cuba. There's American property in Cuba. And it's there to protect American lives and American property that just happen to be in Cuba. So it's not there for war making. It's not there to pass judgment so much. It's there to protect our interests in Cuba. So the battleship had been sent to Cuba to protect American lives and property in and around that island. Well, suddenly, the morning of February 16th, 1898, suddenly the morning of February 16th of 1898,
before the first one you said February 16th, what did you mean, 15th?
no, because the 16th is when it happens. 16th is when it's going to happen. 15th, the battleship's there, right? What happens the 16th? All of a sudden, there's an explosion on the USS Maine of unknown origin. Nobody knows really where it came from. And what happens to the USS Maine after that explosion? It sinks to the bottom of Havana Harbor, killing 260 American sailors. It now becomes a big deal. So what I'm saying, Willow, as I said before, that this is when we went to war. The 16th is correct, but the 15th, I went back to the 15th and stated we had a battleship in Havana Harbor and why it was there. 260 American sailors. So suddenly, the morning of February 16th, the USS Maine becomes a victim of an explosion of unknown origin, didn't know where it came from, and the battleship sank to the bottom of Havana Harbor, killing 260 American sailors. Well, what do you think happened when the word reached back to the United States that the USS Maine had been sunk and 260 American sailors had been killed? They were mad because they knew it was no accident. And all of a sudden, Americans were demanding war and chanting, "Remember the Maine. Remember the Maine." It's just like, remember the Alamo, that's right. So, Americans are very upset about this. And many Americans, after the sinking of the USS Maine, are demanding war between America and the United States. And this whole time, President William McKinley's been trying to avoid it. Well, now he's not going to be able to because you have 260 American sailors' lives lost. Well, he was able to avoid war for 2 months after the sinking of the Maine. How did he do that?
Trying to work it out.
Well, trying to,
Investigate.
yeah, very good. He wanted to make sure before they did anything that, you know, we weren't accusing somebody of doing something that they shouldn't be doing, okay? So he was able to avoid war with Spain for almost 2 months after the sinking of the Maine, but finally public pressure just became too much for him. Pressure was on. So, on April 11th of 1898, the United States of America declared war on the country of Spain.
What day?
April 11th, 1898, the United States declared war on the country of Spain. Now, this was kind of interesting because if you were a foreign country, what might you be thinking since Cuba was only 90 miles from Key West, Florida? What might you be thinking if you're a foreign country when you hear that the United States of America has declared war on Cuba? What? Yeah, and what's going to be the result of that?
They're going to expand
How?
by fighting Cuba.
Yeah, everybody, all these foreign countries saying, man, we're going to war. These guys are going to war because they want to claim Cuba for the United States. And it didn't go over real well because it was like a great big country taking over a small country. So some foreign countries questioned the war on the part of the United States because there was a thought among those foreign countries that the whole reason that the United States had declared war on Spain was to claim the country of Cuba for the United States. Now, one particular person who wanted to squelch those rumors was a senator from Colorado by the name of Henry Teller. And Henry Teller wanted to make it very clear to these foreign countries that the United States had no intention to claim Cuba for their own. And so he even went through Congress and passed an amendment called the Teller Amendment, which stated two things. So, to ensure that the thoughts of the foreign countries were unwarranted, Senator Henry Teller of Colorado sent a resolution through Congress known as the Teller Amendment. And it stated two things. What did it state? What are the two things that the Teller Amendment stated? Officially, that the United States
Won't take Cuba.
would claim no rule over Cuba. That was number one. The United States would claim no rule over Cuba. And the second thing that the Teller Amendment stated was once the United States freed Cuba of Spanish rule, the United States would leave the country and they would pick a government of their own choosing. Okay? So the Teller Amendment stated the following. One, after it was over, the United States would claim no rule over Cuba. And number two, once the island of Cuba was free of Spanish rule, the United States would leave the country and let them decide their government upon themselves. And like Zaid kind of alluded to, when you look at history, we might have been better to take it over for them and for us. Okay? Now, Congress adopted this resolution. They wanted it very clear that Cuba was not going to be a spoil of war for the United States, that we were simply reacting to the sinking of the USS Maine, and our entire goal was not to capture Cuba, but set it free of Spanish rule so they could govern themselves. That was the whole idea. Now, this is interesting because that takes us to our next subtopic, which is battle in the Philippines, not Cuba. Now, Cuba is like down here, right? Where are the Philippines? Over by Japan, long ways away. So you think to yourself, what's he talking about? Battle in the Philippines, not Cuba. The first military action of the Spanish-American War wasn't in Cuba, it was in the Philippines. Because we decided, hell, while we're going to free Cuba of Spanish rule, let's free the Philippines too. Okay? And there was a purpose, a little different purpose in the Philippines than Cuba, which you'll catch. So, the first military action of the Spanish-American War was not in Cuba, it was in the Philippine Islands. Now, I'm telling you what, the Philippine Islands had been owned by Spain forever, since the days of Ferdinand Magellan. Now, you might remember that name from world history or elementary history, I don't know. But Ferdinand Magellan was a pretty important guy. Now, I'm going to read a little bit about him. You don't have to write this down, but I do want you to listen. So, Spain had ruled the Philippines clear back to the days of Ferdinand Magellan. Now, what year are we talking about here? No, what time are we talking about right now? We're talking about this war's happening like in 1898, almost 1900. Now, listen to this. This is about Ferdinand Magellan. In search of fame and fortune, Portuguese explorer Ferdinand Magellan set out from Spain in 1519 with a fleet of 5 ships to discover a western sea route to the Spice Islands. Magellan discovered what is now known as the Strait of Magellan, and he became the first European to cross the Pacific Ocean. The voyage was long and dangerous, and only 1 ship returned home 3 years later. Although it was laden with valuable spices from the east, only 18 of the fleet's original crew of 270 returned with the ship. Magellan himself was killed in battle on the voyage, but his ambitious expedition proved that the globe could be circled by sea and that the world was much larger than had previously been imagined. So what's Magellan? The first one to do what? Go around the globe. But what did he capture in the 1519 area? The Philippines. So think about that. Spain owned the Philippines from like 1519 to 1900. A long, long time. And like the people of Cuba, the Philippine people also wanted freedom in 1900 from Spain. They were sick of Spain as well. Now, the man that really set his sights on the Philippines was Theodore Roosevelt, who at the time was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And he really wanted the Philippines bad. So he was really pleased when he found out that we were declaring war on Spain, because really when you declare war on Spain, you declare war on all of Spain. Okay? And Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Theodore Roosevelt, hoped to gain control of the Philippines. What did he want them for? Very important later in history.
Spices.
What? No, he didn't care about spices. What are they? What can you put on the Philippine Islands that is going to help us in World War II? Bases, military bases. And that's what Roosevelt wanted around 1900, is he wanted to get the Philippines for these military bases that they could put on these islands that would give us a sight of what was going on in Asia and the Pacific. So what he did is he gave orders to a naval commander by the name of George Dewey to attack Manila, the capital of the Philippines. So Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt's all in on this Philippine deal. He wants the Philippines for major naval bases, and so he sends a Navy commander by the name of George Dewey to advance to Manila, which was the capital of the Philippines. Now, in order to capture the Philippines, what Dewey would have to do is destroy the Spanish fleet that was stationed in Manila Harbor. So you got this Spanish fleet that's protecting the Philippines in the Manila Harbor near Manila, the capital. And he being Roosevelt, orders Dewey to attack that Spanish fleet, because defeat of the Spanish fleet in the Manila Bay is going to result in what? Victory, right? Now, the Spanish Navy were just old, aging ships. This is as old as you can imagine. And we have new, at the time, American Navy vessels. And so Dewey went in there and without any trouble at all, sank the entire Spanish fleet to the bottom of Manila Bay in just no time at all. And with that particular victory, 3 things happened. 3 things happened with our victory in the Philippines. First of all, who became an instant hero in American military history? No. George Dewey. George Dewey, the man that captured Manila, the man that defeated the Spanish fleet and gained the Philippine Islands. D-U-W-E-Y.
On your sheet.
E-Y. So, first of all, the results of the victory in the Philippines, Dewey becomes an instant hero back in the United States. The people of the Philippines are set free from what? Spanish rule. They're happy. But unlike Cuba, what was the prize? We now have what? The Philippine Islands. So we weren't after Cuba in the Spanish-American War, but we sure weren't afraid to take the Philippines. And that's why the first battle of the Spanish-American War wasn't in Cuba, it was in the Philippines, because Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt wanted those bases badly. So he went and got them, bang, right off the bat. So, the result of the victory, Dewey becomes an instant hero after the battle back in the United States. The people of the Philippines are set free from Spanish rule, and the United States has the naval bases they so long cherished. Really a pretty brilliant move on Roosevelt's part in the first place. Okay, we'll get a quick start on the Spanish-American War, because it only lasts a summer long. The Spanish-American War, a summer long. Okay, let's go back to the day that the United States declared war upon Spain. Okay, February, what was it? Oh, it was April 11, 1898. As soon as we declared war, President McKinley sent 17,000 troops to Tampa, Florida. Why would he do that? As soon as we declared war, why would he send 17,000 troops to Tampa?
Get ready to send it out.
Well, that's what I